Hello everyone, welcome back to yet another session on Merit Shine. It is said that character gets tested under adversity. While the present situation does not really portray itself as an adversity, but these are definitely testing times. Testing because one, your pattern has changed, and two, there is a definite change in the syllabus as well. But are these changes so huge that we have to panic and let go of what we've done already? Absolutely not. Samir sir and Ratnaba sir have already taken you through the changes in the syllabus, the changes in the pattern, the latest updates as far as the notifications are concerned. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to focus more on the finance section, take you through what exactly is going to be expected. And it's also said that when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So at this point in time, what we need to do is not worry about what has happened in the past. Some of you have already prepared well from a conceptual standpoint. So those of you who have already done that, the change in pattern should not impact you so much. For those of you who have not put in any effort till date, now is probably the time to just jump and dive in without wasting any more time. It is still possible, but it requires Herculean amount of efforts for you to pull this through. As I said, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So from that standpoint, at this stage, what is required is build on the preparation that you've already done and just do a little bit of a recalibration. Now, what do I mean by recalibration? We need to tweak certain elements in the preparation and ensure that we are in the right frame of mind to attempt the two types that are emerging in front of us. One is the objective type questions and also the descriptive type questions. As long as you've tried to prepare in a manner which involves conceptual understanding, this addition of descriptive pattern should not impact you too much. But if you've spent too much time in trying to mug up answers to MCQs and not going into the fundamental concepts, then obviously this might require more effort from your perspective. If you've gone through the fundamental syllabus once from an MCQ standpoint, all it requires right now is a bit of fine tuning, lots of reading and practice. And as long as you do that, you will definitely be able to sail through even now, right? So at this point, the most important thing is to stay focused, not panic, and give it your absolute best shot. And while you're at it, enjoy the improvement in your knowledge. That's the most crucial aspect. As long as you do that, you will definitely be able to sail through this phase as well. So let us try and understand a bit more about the kind of recalibration that would be required from a preparation standpoint so that you're better attuned to what is expected out of this paper, right? So with that in mind, let's quickly jump into the session and I'll move myself away from the screen. Right, so what are we looking at essentially? If you look at a comparison between the syllabus of the last 2 years, you already had the sectional categorizations very clearly defined as far as the 2019 syllabus was concerned. So all of these topics were there, and the ones that have been marked in blue have technically not been included as part of the current syllabus. What it essentially means is that while they may not be tested directly, the information that has actually been learned through these modules from your perspective will again continue to be relevant, and relevant from the standpoint of anything that comes out from a descriptive type question perspective, right? So don't worry that anything that you've read is going to go waste. All of that will definitely come in handy at some point of time or the other, and even more so at the time of the interview stage as well. So don't worry if you've read more. It's always better to know more because it gives you a greater conceptual understanding. So that's not going to deter you in any way as far as your selection is concerned, right? So when you look at it from a 2020 standpoint, or if I have to say panel year 2021, then what exactly are the elements that tend to change? So firstly, the topic as far as financial systems is concerned is quite a lot aligned in terms of what was there in 2019 as well. When you look at regulators of banks and financial institutions and you talk about your RBI functions and conduct of monetary policy, then you have a banking system in India, structure and concerns, and talking about your FIs like your SIDB, Exim Bank, NABARD, NHB, all of those remain the same. But what has changed is basically bringing in two additional points. So one is basically a point which was there in general topics has logically been moved into changing landscape of banking sector as part of financial system. This makes a lot of sense because when you're discussing about the banking system, it makes a lot of sense to talk about the changes in the banking sector as well. So it's basically a recategorization. So nothing much changes for you as far as this point is concerned. But when I talk about point number 5, it talks about impact of the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 and the Indian response to it. So when I talk about this particular point, it actually brings in a greater level of depth in your preparation. Now, why do I say that? Because when you're talking about whatever latest developments that have happened as far as your risk management is concerned, or your corporate governance is concerned, all of these have been in a way governed by what happened during the financial crisis and how one can look at averting such a crisis in the future. So that was the thought process with which these measures came into picture, and that is where understanding the global financial crisis in a greater depth will definitely help you. Right now, similarly, when I look on further, your financial markets pretty much remains the same. There is not much change overall here. All the fundamentals that you've read through are going to be relevant even now. When we talk about general topics, again, some of the basic topics continue to be the same. Only aspect is when we talk about derivatives, it looks like because they've not specifically mentioned forwards, futures, and swaps, it means that options in all probability will also get added. And frankly speaking, options as a derivative instrument, it's definitely one of the more intriguing ones and definitely an important one to understand. So that way also this addition in syllabus makes a lot of sense. Then if you look at the next element, which is point number 3, which is in sync with what we discussed in point number 5 of section A, which is you're talking about global financial crisis of 2007-2008, then we obviously need to talk about what is happening in the global financial markets and international banking as well. So it's a logical conclusion to point number 5. Right? Then we talk about financial inclusion. The use of technology word has been removed from here. Why has it been removed? Because all of that will get incorporated in something called as fintech, which has now become point number 9 of general topics. Right? So again, financial inclusion, a lot of relevance from that perspective as well. Then if you look at 5, your basic topics remain the same over here, which talks about your alternative sources of finance, public and private partnerships, and your private and social cost benefit. All of these continue to remain in your syllabus. Your corporate governance and role of e-governance in addressing corruption and inefficiencies continue to remain. Then your union budget basically does not have each of these individual terms being present, but we're going to look at it more from perspective of concepts, approach, and broad trends. Right? So that is something which is changed overall. As far as inflation is concerned, there is another edition which talks about a striking balance between the inflation and growth through monetary and fiscal policies. Now this is already addressed. If you've read through inflation completely, in the concept standpoint, you would have already covered that as far as your remedies and control measures are concerned. So in that sense, your remedies and control have to happen through the policies that are there from a fiscal and monetary standpoint. So automatically that also gets covered as far as inflation is concerned. And the final point is basically your fintech, which if you've done your preparation properly would have been encapsulated in certain elements already in your preparation, right? So when you talk about recent developments in the financial sector, when you talk about the changing landscape in the banking sector, when you talk about your alternate sources of finance, you talk about latest developments in corporate governance, right? All of these in a way incorporate very critical elements of financial technology, and same is the case with financial inclusion, which talks about the use of technology. So all of these have helped you cover fintech already to a great extent, right? So from that standpoint, fintech is not something which is completely new to you. So here at this stage, we require a certain bit of recalibration that is needed. Now, what do I mean by recalibration at this juncture? You've already been preparing from an objective or an MCQ perspective, which means that you will try to understand concepts and fundamentals, which means you're already decently prepared from that standpoint. And using those concepts, you're going to be answering multiple choice questions, which means you would not have spent too much time in framing answers or putting your thought in writing a big answer, right? That's the fundamental difference, and that's the recalibration that is required, right? All of these topics may not be completely relevant from a descriptive portion standpoint. I'm not saying that descriptive cannot come in a particular topic, but what I'm saying is there is definitely a more higher inclination or a higher proclivity of descriptive questions to be appearing from certain topics rather than most of them, right? So that's something which we want to discuss in a bit. The second thing to concentrate on is, as far as your MCQs are concerned, the strategy continues to remain the same, which means each of the topics that I've already covered, you need to revise them, revisit them from the perspective of multiple choice questions, and that strategy will continue to be as it is. Now, when it comes to descriptive type, your fundamentals of descriptive writing are going to come in extremely handy. The other important point is you need to revisit these topics from the perspective of, let's say if a question comes from here, how am I going to frame my answer to that particular question, right? What are the key points that I would like to add? What are the terms and terminologies that I should be aware of, right? All of those come into the picture. Now, how do I improve my overall descriptive writing skills? So obviously that's completely taken care by Ratnabha sir, and he's obviously taken a lot of sessions overall as well. Having said that, if you keep writing over the next couple of months with the perspective of being very specific in terms of each and every topic, finding out what could be the possible descriptive questions that are there. From that perspective, we will also be spending a lot of time framing different questions that could be possible and what could be the possible model answers to them as well in some cases. And obviously, you can also start framing your own model answers. Now, what happens when you start framing your own model answers is that you're asking your brain to think more analytically and interconnect concepts and latest developments with what you've already studied, and applying those concepts and analytical abilities to answer your questions. The more you write, you'll constantly keep getting better at it. But the important aspect is to start reading as much as possible, because the preliminary requirement for writing is to read enough so that you have enough content at your disposal which can be used at the time of writing. So read, and at the same time spend enough time on writing as well, right? That's going to be the key thing. What is required at this stage is when you're doing your round of revision, your revision would add one more layer to it. Not only will you be preparing from a multiple choice question standpoint, but you will also be looking at a topic and think, okay, what could be the possible descriptive type questions that could emerge from this? And if this particular question comes, how will I frame my answer to this particular question? What would be my key points that I would want to add over here, right? What are the terms and terminologies that I may want to use? And I will also start framing my own answers, right? So the more I start doing that, not only am I revising for MCQs in a way, but I'm also honing my skills from a descriptive standpoint. And last but not the least, this kind of a preparation is also going to make me holistically prepared for your interview stage as well, right? So nothing to be scared of at this point in time. It is only strengthening your overall preparation. And another crucial thing to remember is that this change is not just for you, this is for everyone, right? So everyone is sailing literally in the same boat, so you don't have to be worried or bothered about it at this point in time. So what I'm going to tell you now is what are the topics that are relevant from a descriptive standpoint, but at the same time, it does not mean that if I'm not talking about a particular topic, a descriptive question cannot come from there. Equally possible. But these are the topics where I feel there is a greater likelihood of a descriptive question coming in, right? So we'll talk about those topics. So what you need to do at this point is set up your revision in such a way that you're not only looking at revising the topics that have been mentioned in the syllabus from the perspective of MCQs, but revisit those same set of topics, revisit that cycle, thinking about what could be the possible descriptive questions, what would be the answers that you will frame to them. That's the additional layer that you add to your preparation, and that is the recalibration that I'm talking about. So now let's look at some of the topics that are important from a descriptive standpoint. When I talk about RBI functions and conduct of monetary policy, I feel that this topic is definitely something which is very important from a descriptive standpoint, while it's equally important from an objective standpoint as well, right? So you talk about the RBI Act and the governing principles around that, FRBM, all of them become very important from that standpoint. You can definitely expect short notes that can come in from banking system in India as well, right? Now this one, changing landscape in banking sector, can definitely be one of the critical areas where you can get descriptive questions, right? So let me keep putting them as D over here, right? Now, obviously, since this topic has been added specifically, there is a significant amount of chance that there could be a descriptive question that can emerge from this one as well, right? When I talk about financial markets, it looks more likely that your questions around these should be centered around the MCQs. The likelihood of you getting a question on this on descriptive is slightly on the lower side, right? So similarly, when I talk about general topics, again, risk management is very critical as far as your descriptive is concerned. Again, when I talk about derivatives, not so much on the descriptive, but mostly on the objective MCQ side. Then again, point number 3 in the general topics, which is your global financial markets and international banking, broad trends and latest developments. This definitely looks to be a very good candidate for a descriptive question again, right? Similarly, this topic, financial inclusion, because it is leading to the development of the overall society as a whole, this is definitely a very important topic that can be there as far as descriptive is concerned, right? Now again, when I talk about alternate sources of finance, private and social cost benefit, public-private partnership, if you look at these topics, the incidence of questions from an MCQ standpoint over the years hasn't been that much, right? So ideally, these are again good candidates as far as descriptive type questions are concerned. Now, looking at corporate governance, definitely a candidate for both descriptive as well as objective questions. In fact, objective questions have definitely come from this topic quite frequently in the past, right? So definitely very relevant. Similarly, when you look at this one, role of e-governance in issues of corruption and inefficiency, this definitely is a candidate for a descriptive question, right? Again, union budget, the concepts, approach, and the broad trends, this again is a definite strong candidate towards a descriptive question that can come in, right? Inflation again looks like a more likely candidate for objective questions, but since we are talking about a specific point being added over here, this pointer could be a descriptive category question as well, right? And last but not the least, the emerging trends in fintech, again added as a new topic, could emerge as a question from a descriptive standpoint. Now, the big thing for you to understand at this stage is that the topics that have been specifically added right now, they definitely are very strong contenders for the descriptive questions to appear from, because these are the recent additions that have been made, and the chances of a descriptive question appearing from there is definitely a lot higher. Having said that, the ones where I've not marked D does not mean that there will be no descriptive question from there. It's just that the probability of a descriptive coming in from there is slightly lesser than some of the other topics that we've discussed. So as I said, again, revisit all of those topics that you've already read, revisit them from an MCQ standpoint, and then add another layer to your preparation wherein you're going to be looking at what could be the possible descriptive questions that can emerge from this, and if a descriptive question comes, what will be my answers, what will be the key points that I would like to mention. Keep making those notes from that perspective, and that is the recalibration that is required. So hope this recalibration is very clear to you. So now let us look at what are the approaches that you can look at as far as the overall preparation strategy is concerned. So one of the most critical elements required at this point of time is that there should be absolutely no dearth of reading, right? You've got to read, because if you want to write effectively, you've obviously got to read as much as possible, right? So that is something which has got to become an integral part of your preparation if you've not done that already. Now, if you're someone who's already pretty strong from a conceptual standpoint or has put in a decent amount of preparation, then you must already be doing this quite effectively, right? But if you're someone who's yet to start or has started recently, then this becomes the most crucial aspect, because ultimately whatever you read, it will help you from the MCQ standpoint as well, because when you look at the options, you'll be able to remember or recollect what you've read, and only when you read can you write effectively as well, right? So that's the critical element. Now, when we talk about reading, we talk about the RBI annual report, the economic survey, the union budget updates, and obviously we'll keep sharing updates from that perspective as well, right? So that is something which we will also contribute towards. But the important thing for you to understand is there is no shortcut at this point in time, but to keep reading as much as you can, keep assimilating information and keep absorbing information, keep making your own notes. The more you do that, the better you'll be prepared on the D-Day, right? Now, when it comes to descriptive writing specifically, right, you cannot just assume this like any other ordinary exam that you did or appeared for during your school or your college days. It's not the same, right? As far as the school or the college exam was concerned, you could write something and still get away with it. It's very difficult to expect a similar situation here, wherein you can write something random and still expect some grace marks, right? So technically, that's not the way it's going to work. You have to have your answers well thought out, right? Your answers need to be crisp. They need to be full of good content, right? And they need to be highly structured. Only when you follow this will you be able to score well as far as your descriptive writing, as far as your individual subjects are concerned. So when we look at the descriptive writing section from an English standpoint as well, that section also cannot be termed as generic, right? So because some of the topics that have come over the years have always had some sense of banking or financial awareness element interwoven, which means if you do not have a good or a strong understanding of what's happening in the banking or financial sector, you will not be able to pen down a good essay. So from that perspective, the preparation that you've already put in as far as your descriptive language section of English is concerned, that itself is going to help you immensely as far as your ESI and FM descriptive sections are concerned, because you're already preparing to write for specific elements within the banking and financial sector. So your knowledge of those terms and terminologies is already reasonably good enough. All you need to do is get even more specific, even more into the details, and that is going to help you prepare for the descriptive portions as far as ESI and FM are concerned as well, right? So your existing descriptive section preparation is also going to bolster your preparation for your descriptive portions within ESI and FM. Next thing, it's important to understand the interlinkages that are there. So when you understand a particular concept, right, you also have to look at it from a perspective of where all does it fit in, where all will it come into relevance. For example, when we talk about global financial crisis, what is happening internationally from a global perspective, you always need to think about risk management. You will always think about corporate governance, right? All of those things will definitely come to the fore, right? And all your concepts have to be linked from that perspective. So whenever you're coming across a new term in your preparation, the other way to look at it is when you're revisiting or revising a particular term or a particular concept, think as to where this particular term or this particular concept will fit in from your topic standpoint, right? Where all can I use this particular term or this concept as part of an answer? The more you start doing that, your recollection ability at the time of exam will be significantly higher. Right? So Funda is very simple. When you're looking at a particular topic or revisiting a particular topic, think of it, okay, ये वाला particular topic मैं कहाँ पे use कर सकता हूँ अगर मुझे descriptive में लिखना पड़े? Where will I use this particular topic if I have to write a descriptive answer? So let's say, for example, I talk about corporate governance and I talk about Sarbanes-Oxley's Act, right? So in that context, it will come into the fore when we talk about the global financial crisis, right? Or let's say, for example, I'm talking about alternative sources of finance and I'm specifically looking at things like, let's say, venture capital funding or let's say revenue-based financing, then this would become a part of the latest developments as far as the financial sector is concerned. So the idea is when you're preparing or when you're revising your concepts, first thing you revise it from an MCQ standpoint. Second is you look at what are the possible questions that could arrive from there and how will you frame your answers and what would be the points that you would write in that. And the third element is if I'm looking at a particular concept or a particular topic, where will it fit in from my syllabus standpoint, right? So when I do that, what happens is whenever a particular descriptive question comes, then I'll be able to interlink this particular topic to that particular question, right? Which is where you have to think. So let's say, for example, when I talk about revenue-based financing, I can always incorporate that as part of my alternate sources of finance. I can incorporate that as part of my knowledge in fintech. I can also look at it from the perspective of what is happening globally and the international banking fraternity as well. So overall, I'm able to link that particular topic to 3 different questions within the descriptive section. So I hope you're getting what I'm trying to say. So when you start looking at each individual concept or each individual topic from that standpoint, your descriptive writing skills will constantly keep getting better because you'll be able to link that particular topic to what is expected in that particular answer, right? That is where I'm talking about the interlinkages, and that is something that you need to keep revising and keep putting in effort. The more you start doing that, you'll get better at it over a period of time. Next thing, right? So when I talked about reading, obviously you have to be updated in terms of whatever's appearing in the financial dailies and also keep reading good editorials. The reason I want you to read good editorials like the Hindu is because it'll give you good insights into how effectively can you frame a particular piece of writing, right? So that is where your good editorials will come in handy. And obviously financial dailies, it's up to you whether you want to choose a Business Standard or a Financial Express or an Economic Times. It's entirely your choice, but it'll keep updating you in terms of what's happening latest as far as the banking fraternity is concerned. And that knowledge is definitely going to help you in your descriptive writing and also in your interviews. And there could be MCQs that could appear from there as well, right? So this again forms a important part of your overall preparation, right? Another crucial element that you need to understand at this point is what is called as your time management. So the first thing required from a time management standpoint is you've got 90 minutes and in all probability you will have 4 questions, right? So you have 2 15-mark questions and 2 10-mark questions. So you've got to manage your time effectively. So what you need to figure out is what exactly is your average writing speed at this point in time to be able to arrive at what kind of a number are you looking at as far as the exam is concerned. Second thing, the entire 90 minutes you may not be able to write. You also need to think what exactly are you going to write. You need to structure your answer. So accordingly, think of time management very, very carefully, right? So the word limit has not specifically been mentioned at this point in time, but think of it from the perspective that you have to be able to attempt 2 15-mark and 2 10-mark questions. The time allocation to those questions has to be accordingly in a pro rata basis so that you don't end up wasting too much time on a 10-mark question and get very little time to write a 15-mark question answer, right? So from that perspective, think through your time management strategy very, very clearly at this point in time. And the way you'll get better at time management is only through practice. The more you practice, the more you put yourself in that environment, you'll start getting better and better at it. When you talk about the descriptive section, when I talk about a 10-mark question or a 15-mark question, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a complete 10-mark question or a complete 15-mark question. There could be multiple parameters that could be tested here as well. It could also be a possibility that you might be asked to write short notes on a few topics, right? And the numbers could actually be split, let's say 5 questions of 3 marks, or let's say 3 questions of 5 marks, or let's say 4 questions of 2.5 marks. Anything can happen, right? Don't be of that mindset that this is going to be a single line or a 2-line question and the entire 10 marks will be allocated to the same question itself. Always be prepared mentally that the question could be split into multiple parts as well, and you will need to answer each of those parts for getting specific number of marks in that particular question, right? So be mentally prepared that that is a definite possibility, right? And not just writing short notes, but it could also be talking about things which are slightly more conceptual in nature, wherein you may have to explain how a particular thing works, right? So be mentally prepared that those kind of questions can also appear, right? That is where your efforts around time management become extremely important. Now, the other important thing which I want to highlight is there are certain approaches that you can take as far as your descriptive writing is concerned. The first one is what I call as the doctor, right? So whenever you visit a doctor, the first thing that comes up is the symptoms. What are the problems or what are the issues that are actually visible? Now, the problems or issues that are visible are actually the symptoms, but they may not necessarily be the actual problem. So you need to arrive at the root cause or the actual problem in itself. So what are the symptoms? What is the actual problem or what is the actual root cause? Now, what kind of a treatment or measures or reforms or committee recommendations that can be given in order to overcome that particular problem or solve that particular issue or overcome that particular cause which is leading to those symptoms, right? So that is the overarching structure as far as a doctor is concerned. So whenever you get questions around a problem, look at the symptoms. What are the visible problems or the visible challenges that are there, right? Then look at the root cause for these visible challenges. Now, how do you eradicate those root cause, right? Are you looking at a short-term solution? Then what are the short-term solutions? Then what are the long-term solutions, right? What are the recommendations that have probably been put forth by a regulatory committee that has been set up by the Reserve Bank of India, right? That could also be a possible outcome over there. Or also think of what are the reform measures that have been adopted with that particular view in mind. So all of those things become relevant, and that is the first structure that I'm talking about, which is the doctor. The next thing, you have two more approaches that you can adopt. One is obviously a timeline principle. So let's say, for example, you get a question as to how the foreign exchange policy in India has evolved since 1991 or probably even before that. Then it probably will follow a timeline principle wherein you'll talk about, let's say, pre-1991, then 1991 to, let's say, a particular stage, and then moving on further with the advent of FEMA, what exactly happened, and then where do we stand currently. So that's a timeline approach, right? So you look at timelines and you frame your answer accordingly. And a third possibility is that you can basically look at something called as a pro and con kind of an approach, right? And you always look at taking a balanced or a neutral stand. Now, it may be heavily skewed towards the pro side or heavily skewed towards the con side, which is fine, but as long as you support your answer with enough arguments, right, then it is absolutely fine. So that is the pro-con approach. So basically looking at a doctor approach or a timeline approach or a pro-con approach in order to answer the questions from a descriptive perspective. And again, reiterating this very, very important, time management is going to be of absolute essence. You cannot afford to miss a question, right? And don't be under the assumption that if you write something random, then you will be given marks. That's not how this will work. You have to go conceptually, you have to be crisp, and you have to have a structure in place. So now let us look at some of the questions that have appeared in the previous years as far as your descriptive section is concerned. Now, a disclaimer here, many of these questions were definitely relevant in that particular year in terms of what was happening in the Indian and the global banking scenario. Many of these questions are still relevant today, but there is a high likelihood that something that is burning in terms of what's happening as a latest issue or a latest challenge, or let's say latest development, the chances of such questions appearing is a lot more stronger, which is where the importance of your financial dailies goes up significantly higher, and obviously your understanding of the annual report, economic survey, monetary policies, and all of those things become extremely important. So the more you read, the more you understand, the better you'll be prepared to handle the descriptive section, right? So let's say, for example, we talk about what is meant by merchant banking and discuss in detail the various functions performed by merchant bankers. From a fundamental definition standpoint, a merchant bank is historically a bank dealing in commercial loans and your investments, right? And technically in the context today, you're talking about your investment banks as well, right? And these were the first modern banks and basically evolved from your medieval merchants that were there in the past, right? And essentially looking at your trades in commodities, etc. So that's the fundamental thought process. Now, let's say, for example, in the modern parlance, what does merchant bank stand for? It essentially refers to a financial institution that basically conducts your underwriting, your loan services, financial advisory, and let's say fundraising services for large corporations and also HNIs or your high net worth individuals. Right, so these are banks which are experts in international trade and thereby making them specialists in terms of dealing with MNCs. The other important aspect is, unlike let's say your retail or your commercial banks, your merchant banks do not provide financial services to the general public, right? That's the fundamental idea about merchant banking, and so essentially that is what is being talked about over here. And the next question basically talks about FEMA and the salient features. So obviously it's a straightforward question wherein your understanding of FEMA gets put to the test. The next question basically looks at tax is a burden on the present and debt puts a burden on the repayment of future generations. It's more like an essay itself in the context of bringing in your points from that perspective. Right, so you can definitely bring that in. And this is obviously a question which is more suited to, let's say, the descriptive section of the English language. Right, so you can definitely write a technical answer here as well, but it's more like a long answer essay. Right. When I look at question 4, this again is very interesting because it talks about explaining the different methods of credit control in India. So when you talk about credit control, you can look at two aspects, which is the qualitative and the quantitative aspects. Right. So when you talk about the quantitative aspects, you will essentially write about things like your bank rate, your open market operations, right, your sale and purchase of securities or the government securities that the RBI does, right? So that is something which will come in over here. Then you have your reserve requirements. You talk about your CRR, SLR, all of that comes in over here. Then essentially when you talk about your qualitative methods, it can be basically the imposition of your margin requirements. And there's another important term which is basically known as your moral suasion, wherein technically the RBI is not necessarily reprimanding any bank or issuing any fine for any commercial bank, but it is basically writing or giving oral advices to those banks in order to restrict or expand the credit. Then other possibilities obviously that the RBI could also take any direct action against some of these banks who are not following the rules and regulations as laid down by the RBI. Then the RBI can obviously look at the rationing of the credit, right? It basically refers to the limiting of the amount of credit which is issued by all your commercial banks. And all of those come into the picture, right? So the RBI in this case fixes the size of issuing the credit according to the requirements of the country. So all of those things come in as far as your credit control is concerned. Then question 5 specifically deals with securitization. So I'm not going to get in the specifics of each and every question. The idea of sharing these questions here was to give you an inclination of what kind of questions have appeared in the past, right? And again, this is just to give you an idea. It doesn't mean that the questions that will appear this year are going to be on similar lines. They could be entirely different as well, but this just gives you an idea, and that's the whole thought process behind sharing these questions with you at this point, right? Then again, when you look at questions, there have been questions around union budget in the past. One was specifically, in one of the years, it was specifically asking about the union budget. In another year, it was basically the union budget along with the provisions related only to financial, banking and insurance sectors. Questions like 7 have also appeared in the past, wherein it is highly conceptual, wherein you're talking about inflation but relating high inflation to internal and external disequilibrium and talking in more specific context in terms of what is happening in the current account deficit and the weakening of the rupee. So such kind of questions are also possible, wherein you cannot just faff around. You'll have to be very specific in terms of what you answer in such questions, right? So just like your question 2.8 was also dealing with your FEMA, how the guidelines have evolved from moving from a FERA to a FEMA, from a regime wherein you were considered to be guilty even before you could prove yourself to be innocent, to a regime wherein you got the opportunity to follow the guidelines at the same time prove your innocence as well. So that was the context, and how the evolution has happened is what question 8 talks about. Then if you look at question number 9 and question 14, these have more specifically to do with specific provisions of the RBI Act. 9 basically went on to address the NBFCs, and the last question basically talked about the idea of giving differential licenses for small banks and what is the thought process behind that. Why do you need a small bank in place, and how is it conceptually different from, let's say, a payments bank, right? And what are the thought processes behind giving differential bank licenses? So that is something which has appeared in the past as well. There have also been questions which have specifically talked about writing short notes on various topics, from something as basic as, let's say, stock market index or securitization, to swaps, to substandard assets, to even SEBI, service tax, syndicated loans. All these have appeared in the past, right? Then essentially talking about what are the different types of exchange risks that are inherent in your foreign exchange business. This question has also appeared. As I said, again, questions around union budget, right? And then basically talking about the financial sector reforms in India since 1992. 1. Now this is just to give you a flavor of what kind of questions have appeared in the past. So this is, as I said, no way an indication of the exact kind of questions that will appear this year, nor am I saying that this kind of questions cannot appear this year either. So this basically just gives you a thought process as to how you need to recalibrate your preparation. That's the only intent of sharing these questions, right? So you have to constantly think of a question. What are the possible points that come to your mind? If you're not able to get any points in your mind, obviously you need to go back to the drawing board, read more about it and get those points in, right? Don't be bothered too much about the quality of the English used in the writing, because here the test is more about how effectively have you understood the concept and how are you able to link it with what's happening in the world currently and how are you able to structure it effectively. So as I said, crisp, content driven and structured. That has to be the main focus at this point in time. Now, descriptive language English is a different ball game altogether, wherein your English skills also come to the fore. But here I'm not saying that the language skills is not required, but the element is that the emphasis on conceptual understanding here is more than the language itself, because your concepts in ESI and your concepts in FM will get tested more than any other elements. That's the main idea behind descriptive in ESI and descriptive in FM, right? So I hope this would have given you an idea of what kind of questions can be expected and what's the line of thought as far as the RBI is concerned. So they're going highly conceptual, so it's important that you go conceptual as well. As we draw to a close to this particular session, what I want to do was maybe take one particular topic and give you the context of, let's say, how you would have looked at it from a perspective of MCQs and how will you look at it when you write a descriptive answer. So the topic which I thought was relevant, especially in the context of, let's say, the addition of global financial crisis and what's happening internationally, was talk about Basel, right? So let's try and look at some of the questions that have appeared from a Basel standpoint in the past. And let's say if there is going to be a descriptive question, what could that question be and what would probably a model answer look like, right? So I'll move myself out of the screen and we'll quickly get into that, right? So when I look at some of the questions that have appeared, they basically talked about which are the three pillars under Basel, right? So we know that it talks about your minimum capital requirements. The second pillar talks about your supervisory review process. And the third pillar talks about market discipline. So the questions would probably have multiple choices and one of those will not be the correct option, and obviously you have to go ahead and mark that option, right? Then which are the risks that are covered under Basel? Then you talk about your credit risk, your market risk and your operational risk, and let's say there's a fourth option which is not one of these three, and that becomes your answer automatically, right? What all basically constitutes as capital under Basel? You talk about your additional tier 1 capital, your common equity tier 1 capital, then you have terms like your tier 1, tier 2 capital, then you have your capital conservation buffer. All these are basically part of the capital as far as the Basel requirements are concerned. Now the point is, you will have questions around these, and this is how MCQs usually appear. So obviously these are just some of the questions, but if you want to go a little bit more in depth, you can look at what is the level of capital adequacy ratio required, right? What does CCC, right? So all of those kind of questions can definitely appear as far as your MCQs are concerned. So obviously when you look at reading a topic holistically, MCQs are not that difficult to crack if you understand the concept fully and if you've known all the terms that are there as far as that topic is concerned. But the challenge now will be when I look at showing you a particular question from a descriptive standpoint and think how will you frame the answer to that particular question, right? So I'll move myself out of the screen now. So let's say, for example, you get this particular question, which says that explain in detail the evolution of Basel norms since inception and also in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, and assume that this was a 15-mark question that came your way. Now that you've seen this question, spend around 30 seconds to try and think as to what all things would you want incorporated as far as this particular answer is concerned, what all elements would you want to be added, and that will give you an insight as to how you need to recalibrate your preparation as well. To what extent do you need to go back and revisit? That is something which will be clear once you figure out your model answer to this question. Now don't get hassled if you're not able to think of anything at this point of time at all. It's absolutely fine, because your mind is not attuned to descriptive writing for, let's say, specific sections like ESI and FM at this point in time. So that is where the recalibration comes in. So once you start revising topics, you need to recalibrate from the standpoint that agar isme descriptive aaya, if a descriptive question comes from here, what could that question be? And if that question is there in front of me, what would I write? Right? So that is something which is definitely going to help you. So have those pointers very clear in your mind. Right? So again, I'll move myself out of the screen and I'll give you a model or a sample answer to this particular question. Again, I'm not saying that this is the perfect answer or the best answer. And that's the beauty of descriptive, right? It's basically a person's ability to write, right, and bring forth their thoughts and ideas. And no two people can write in the same way. So there is no perfect answer, there is no right answer, right? But the idea should be to try and encapsulate all the critical points or all the critical elements. That's what you're looking at. So I'm going to present an answer in front of you. Try and see if you also thought about the same points, or let's say whatever that came to your mind. And that is something which will give you an idea as to how you need to recalibrate as far as the descriptive preparation for this particular section is concerned, right? So I'll move myself out of the screen and we quickly look at the answer. So first of all, obviously I'll look at an introduction, right? So I start off with, let's say, how I go about defining your Basel norms, right? And they're internationally agreed set of measures developed by the Basel Committee. And we're talking about BCBS, which is your Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, in response to the challenges faced by the financial and capital markets, and which is aiming to set minimum standards and requirements for internationally active banks and your financial institutions. So basically giving a broad introduction to what Basel is all about and who basically came up with the concept of Basel. That is the first introduction part. Then we quickly move on to the initial stages. So again, what approach we've used is the timeline approach in this case, wherein you're starting off with Basel I, which came up in 1988. Now, even if you don't know 1988, you can still say 1980s. So, I mean, technically 1980s would have been a number that I would expect you to remember. May not be 1988, but that's good to know because it just adds more factual weight to your answer, but it's not going to actually add any significant value in terms of a number, right? So it's either 1980s or 1988, it's absolutely fine, right? What is the content that matters? So when you say Basel I, it basically talks about the BCBS trying to establish a bank asset classification, wherein your ability to classify the assets of a particular bank and also in the process lowering many risk profiles. Now, obviously, when you lower risk profiles, it automatically leads to significant increase in the investments as well, right? So what it did was it paved the way for the best practices and regulations in the banking sector, right? And the idea here was to focus on capital adequacy of your financial institutions, right? And then specifically giving some insights about capital adequacy risk, you talk about the capital adequacy risk, which is the risk that an unexpected loss will hurt a financial institution. The categorization of your assets of your financial institutions basically is into 5 risk categories, where you talk about your 0%, 10%, 20%, 50%, and 100%. So that was what Basel I was all about. Then you basically move into Basel II, which was basically in 2004, and instead of that you can write early 2000s as well. And then you say the major target in Basel II was to basically strengthen your capital requirements further and to set up regulatory review frameworks, right? The idea was to make sure that your bank's capital becomes more sensitive to risk, promoting greater level of risk management for large banks, and basically setting up your standardized techniques and approaches for evaluating various banks. So that was the idea behind Basel II coming to the fore, right? And the second Basel Accord is basically also known as the revised capital framework, right? Also known as Basel II. It basically served as an update to Basel I. That's what we're trying to highlight. And then mainly the 3 pillars come into existence at this point in time, and you basically highlight the pillars in terms of minimum capital requirements. Then you talk about your supervisory review, right, of any institution, be it financial or otherwise, in terms of its capital adequacy and their internal assessment processes. So that is what your supervisory review talks about. And the third pillar essentially talks about market discipline in the context of effectively using disclosures as a lever to strengthen your market discipline. So this is what came up in Basel II. Then what happened was the crisis itself, right? Now, before the crisis, there was obviously a period of excess liquidity in the market, right? And this was something which was not gauged effectively by the banks, right? And many of them were not able to see this problem very clearly. They thought they did possess liquidity, but the challenge was that the banks eventually discovered they had insufficient liquidity reserves to meet their obligations. And also there was another problem, that the quality of the capital that they possessed, this is where your subprime crisis came to the fore, the quality of the capital, right, was also inadequate, right? So then Basel III allowed the reforms of the entire banking sector landscape. So what you've done in this case is that you've introduced the topic, you've briefly talked about the history of Basel in terms of Basel I, Basel II, that's a timeline approach. Then the next in the timeline was the crisis, and as soon as the crisis unfolded, the banks realized that, oh man, there is so much more to do, and that is where your Basel III comes to the fore, and that's what will be the next point as far as the answer to this particular question is concerned. So what happens next is we basically go into Basel III, right? And this obviously came as a response to the global financial crisis, right? And it basically aimed at reforming and enhancing the regulation, the supervision, and the risk management within the entire banking sector, right? So enhancing regulation, enhancing supervision, and the risk management, right? It was basically kind of building on the two previous accords, that is Basel I and Basel II, and Basel III essentially focused on each individual bank's ability to withstand any kind of financial stress that were there within the system, and also to reduce any kind of system-wide shocks which basically led to your financial crisis, right? So the system-wide shock is something that you would want to avoid, and that's what Basel III was trying to achieve. Now, if you look at the overall context, the BCBS basically considered poor governance and the risk management. So poor governance because there were not enough strong internal measures or internal controls, and obviously poor risk management tools, and as a result, creation of inappropriate incentive structures, right? So you were incentivizing people to sell more, right, and not effectively incentivizing people who were trying to regulate the bank itself, right? That's where incentive structures were inappropriate, right? And definitely a banking industry that was highly leveraged, right, were considered to be as the reasons for the collapse, right? Now Basel III was intended to strengthen the bank capital requirements, and how did they plan to do that? By increasing the bank's liquidity, right, bringing in greater amount of capital norms, and decreasing the amount of leverage that was there within the banks. It also brought in the capital conservation buffer, right, which obviously says that the banks during the good times need to build up a certain level of a capital buffer that can be drawn from when there is a stressful scenario that emerges. So what is the CCB that you maintain during the good times? That also was something that was brought in, right? Then Basel III also introduced two other liquidity ratios. One was obviously your LCR, or your liquidity coverage ratio, which was basically to ensure a sufficiently high level of high quality liquid assets, and it also led to the bringing in of NSFR, which was basically your net stable funding ratio, which was to promote resilience over a long-term horizon. So that was the thought process, right? Moving further, what happened is post-crisis, again, the Basel norms have evolved over the years, right? So we talk into the next stage, which is the post-crisis phase. So again, when you talk about the Basel Accords, they've continued to evolve over the years, and the regulators argue that these changes are simply completing the Basel III reforms, which were agreed in principle way back in 2010-11. The other important aspect is, although most of the Basel III reforms were agreed in detail at that time, these are sometimes also referred to as Basel IV standards, which are basically changes to your global bank capital requirements that were agreed in 2017 and that are due for implementation in January 2023. Now, to be honest, the implementation can extend beyond 2023 to, let's say, a 2027 period as well, and that's the scheme that you're looking at. Now, technically, there is debate on whether you should call it Basel III or Basel 3.1 or updates to Basel III or Basel IV, but just as an indication, we've clarified it also that there are certain times it is referred to as Basel IV, otherwise it's basically updations to the Basel III reforms itself. So, right, you're talking about that thus from 12 to 20, the committee has addressed challenges like margin requirements, right, the exposure that banks have to central counterparties, right, the measurement of, let's say, counterparty credit risk exposures, right, and enhancement of the framework for disclosure requirements, right? So how effectively can we ensure that there is a framework in place so that disclosures can happen effectively and your market discipline is maintained? So all of that has actually evolved, right? And several novel processes were also set up, right, which were like similar to changes in the Pillar 1, which basically brought in your capital adequacy ratio, CAR, right? And in particular, when you're talking about the definition of capital and the minimum CAR requirements, then you also brought in the calculation of your capital requirements for securitizations, and this was done basically by the FRTB capital requirements framework, which is known as your fundamental review of the trading book, right? And new standards were also put in place for the calculation of capital requirements. And when you say capital requirements, in this case, you're specifically talking about credit risk, your credit valuation adjustment risk, and then your operation risk, right? Now, the objective is to reduce the excess variability in terms of the risk-weighted assets, right? So when your assets are available on the books and you obviously have to risk weight them, there can be significant variations in the values of the RWA and how do you minimize such variations. That was the intent, right? And similarly, you talk about your Basel IV, which introduces changes that limit the reduction in capital that can result from banks' use of internal models under the IRB or the internal ratings based approach, right? So that's the latest developments that have happened. So there's a possibility that you might not have come across this particular segment because while you're talking about the Indian context, you were always looking at Basel III and what were the frameworks and the latest developments that were there. But now with the latest syllabus, which talks about the global financial crisis and latest developments in the banking fraternity as well, you need to also look at what's happening from a updated version of Basel III, or technically so-called Basel IV, and what are the changes happening there as well. So which is where this particular answer tells you that you have to look at the global banking fraternity as a whole as well. So from that standpoint, this particular paragraph makes a lot of sense. Now that we have encapsulated this, let's quickly move into the conclusion part, right? How do you conclude this kind of a answer? Then you go on to conclusion saying that in the wake of the present extent of global interlinkages, the Basel norms have basically acted as a vanguard in the fight against any more ensuing crisis that may befall in the banking system, right? So they've kind of taken the fight against any such crisis that can happen and acting as a protector in a way, right? Having said that, considering the level of sophistication and complexity the banking systems present, there is a lot more that needs to be done, especially from an execution standpoint, and we've only just scratched the surface, right? So this in a way culminates the overall answer and concludes it effectively. Now when you look at the overall answer itself, it's actually quite large. And the reason I wanted to give you a longer answer is so that you get a context of how you're looking at framing it. Your actual answer may not be this long, and there might be shorter versions that you can create out of this, right? And this is the thought process that should be there as far as framing a long answer question is concerned. So in this case, we specifically use the timeline approach, wherein we started with an introduction, then we use the timeline, and then we concluded the answer. And try and bring in as many concepts and fundamentals as you're aware of on that particular topic. That's the whole idea, right? The reason I chose this particular question was this was also in sync with the changing syllabus in terms of what's happening globally and the global trends as well. And that's the reason why I incorporated this particular question, because that last paragraph essentially talks about things which probably you would not have come across, specifically looking at it from a India standpoint or a Basel III standpoint, right? So that is more from a global perspective. That is where this question made a lot of sense, right? So again, this was just to give you a flavor. As I said earlier, there is no perfect model answer, right? There might be several other elements that can be added to this. There are several things that can be cut short as well, and the answer can be made even more crisper, but this is just to give you an idea or an indication, right? And as I said, one of the most important thing for you is to manage your time effectively. You cannot mess up on that front, because that's the most crucial aspect. And if you have to manage time effectively, you need to ensure that you practice enough sitting in those 1.5 hour settings and see how effectively are you writing, what is your average writing speed on a keyboard, and how much time are you taking to formulate your thoughts. All of those things come to the fore as far as your overall preparation is concerned. So that brings us to the end of this particular session, right? The idea of this session was to give you a flavor of what exactly is required from a recalibration perspective, what exactly do you need to do from a fine-tuning standpoint, and all it requires is to revisit the topics or revise the topics that you've already gone through and just add one more layer of preparation to it. And what is that layer of preparation? What are the possible descriptive questions that can come from here? And what would be the key points that I would want to highlight or answer in these questions? And next aspect is, whenever you're going through a particular topic or a concept, think of what all are the areas where this concept can be used as a pointer in the descriptive section. So once you start interconnecting those elements, you will see that all of this becomes a lot more easier, right? So the good thing that you need to look at from all of this is that it is just making you more conceptually stronger as a banker, right? And those are the kind of bankers that this country needs at this point in time, right? So fundamentally strong, able to tackle the situation. And as I said in the beginning, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. These are definitely testing times, and what it requires at this point in time is focus and sincere efforts, and I'm sure that you'll be able to sail through with flying colors, right? So I hope this session was useful. So even if you're starting from scratch today, or let's say you have been preparing but you do not remember many things, it's okay, it's quite normal. You can always start afresh and put in the efforts that are required, it is still doable in the time that's available at your disposal, right? Forget about everything else over the next 2 months and simply concentrate on cracking this exam, because this can have a massive positive upside potential on your future. So keep that in mind. So until the next session, this is Ravi signing off. Have a great week ahead. Keep preparing, keep working hard, and I'll see you in the next one.